thank you for the introduction. It is an honor for me to speak to you. So many people actually working at the front line, directly helping people. As I'm mostly an animal researcher, I hope that you also see the value of animal research, and I can add to the discussions today. So, methamphetamine, just briefly, Australia is third in the world for per capita consumption, and one of the reasons is that it's quite easy to make, and it's really interesting because there are sort of poverty-stricken countries such as North Korea, and they use methamphetamine to stave their hunger, and they say, there's ice but no rice, and so it's a very interesting drug because it's easy to manufacture, and I think Australia is a highly relevant place. And is that actually really harmful? Well, I just want to focus on one measure because I do want to talk about animal stuff. It is the case that meth-related deaths is increasing, and it is mostly overdose. And this parallel to this statistic is actually the purity. And this comes a bit relevant to when we study methamphetamine consumption in animals. But because we do think that partly street meth is becoming purer and purer in the content or concentration of methamphetamine, it may be explaining why people are dying more from it as well. So we think it's important. And checking all these statistics, I came across this website. And it's very interesting because this website was really focusing on the young age, but it didn't really have, statistics to support why, but we all have this sort of feeling that, we should help young people, and that's when drug use starts. What really happens is that overall illicit drug use or even alcohol use is pretty much a neurodevelopmental disorder. A lot of the reward circuitry, a lot of the habit response circuitry does form during this time. And more research, as our imaging technology becomes better and better, we know that our brain has a very protracted development. And I joke about how, until you're about 30, it's probably not safe. You're probably still an adolescent. And I was invited to Singapore to talk about ice use and drugs and internet addiction, and they said, can you do a little short phrase for our Instagram? And so I said, kids, don't do drugs until you turn 30, and then they censored the final bit off. Very Singaporean. And then they post the first bit. Anyway, so it is a very neurodevelopmental disorder, but not many people actually study it that way, and definitely in the animal research setting, people do not consider age as a factor. So in humans, at least, we know that earlier the age of first use, the more severe the addiction or harmful usage later in life, and also earlier the age of onset of use, when they are being treated, they tend to be quite resistant and they relapse more as well. So my passion in general is to really understand how age plays a role, and most of my research looks at age-related phenomena. And then this is Australian statistics. So if you look at the usage in the last 12 months, it's actually quite high. But it is decreasing, which is promising. But despite the decrease, the deaths are increasing, probably related to concentration. But you can tell that, whenever I present these statistics, it is a developmental thing. And it's very likely that these people may have started. And it'll be really good to do a longitudinal study and to actually track what makes people stop and what makes people don't stop when they start during adolescence. When I say adolescence from now, I mean the age before 21. So we first decide to actually really highlight that methamphetamine is under-researched. And so we just simply did a PubMed search, and you can tell that compared to other illicit substances, methamphetamine, especially by itself, but conjunction with also amphetamine, is quite under-researched compared to other drugs, and this is disproportionate to the related harm. I think when you look at it, we are very historical. Sometimes people just do things because that's just what they've always have done. And I think this reflects that because it has received attention, probably because of Breaking Bad, people are starting to look at it rather than because of harm. But if we actually add the word adolescent to it, basically there's negligible research. There's really not much out there. There's a handful in animal research, and I think there's a couple in human research. So that's my passion. But when we start to try to look at biology, because we think that, well, if it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, then the brain maturation would have something to do with it. There was no model. There was people just sort of injecting and seeing how they behave, looking at the brains. There's even sort of a perpetuated myth that methamphetamine is less toxic in the adolescent brain. That's not quite replicated, but because there's so few studies and there's not a good model that we can capture what we see in humans, in animals, we think that there's that's a really lacking a gap in the research. So we just started off with trying to develop a model that makes sense in terms of human behavior. So how do we do this? This is what we call intravenous self-administration model. So unfortunately, a lot of people just inject drugs, and when they inject drugs to animals, they really give toxic levels, and that does not reflect what would actually happen in real life. No human's just gonna go, okay, I'm gonna decide to have methamphetamine and give myself ton of one shot, and then my brain's gonna change. So we only look at drug use in terms of when the animals get to administer it themselves. So we give them a surgery, so we catheterize their jugular vein, and then the tubing can come out of the back, which we can connect to a pump, which is controlled by a computer, which is controlled by the animal itself. And we always have an active lever and inactive lever. So active lever is the one that's going to trigger an infusion directly into its heart, the drug. And we always have a cue also to signal drug delivery. So in our particular model, the cue only comes on when the drug is being infused. Inactive lever is a handy tool to measure just general level of activity. You think that if the animal is actually seeking or going for the drug, then you should actually press the active lever more. So this is what it looks like. So that's the rat. So in rats, compared to humans, most of rats, especially methamphetamine compared to other drugs actually, they quite like it. Most rats pick it up straight away. I mean, their life is pretty boring, so when they get in here, it's like fun thing to do for the day. Anyway, so this is what it looks like. And so when we give methamphetamine in adolescent and adult rats, that's what we first started off with. And so this is work of my student who just passed her PhD. So if we look at number of infusions at a particular dose that was quite common to acquire, so it's a quite low dose that wouldn't be so anxiogenic but more rewarding. They do eventually learn to press lever more and get a certain, maintain a stable level of responding. So in this initial phase, we didn't see any age differences, but because I don't usually do this, but in Australia, meth purity is a concern. We decide to actually up the dose and see what happens. And when we have up the dose, we saw a significant age effect. So adolescents tend to press more and give themselves infusions. And if you actually look at it, so the way the pharmacology works is that if you triple the concentration, the way the body physiologically processes it is a double, because we process drugs in a logarithmic way. So that's doubling the dose. And it's amazing that, so that's why the scale bar has halved, because I've doubled the dose. And adults tend to actually titrate. So they sort of go, oh, this is too high, and then they reduce the intake. But it looks like adolescents are not as good at it. And then we went down the dose and see what happened. And it doesn't look like there's an effect when we lower the dose. So it's something about increase in dose that has an effect, and we'll get back to that later. So next thing and if we actually plot as consumption of meth milligrams per kilogram, you can tell that they're pretty much, adolescents and adults are exactly the same at these two doses, but as the dose goes up, adolescents actually like it quite more. So next thing we examined is a progressive ratio. So this is when every time you get a hit of methamphetamine, you have to actually press a lot more levers. Like you have to press like 90 times to get your 9th shot. So you have to press more and more, and you have to work really hard for it. And so one of the hypotheses about adolescent vulnerability is that maybe they're just motivated. They're lazy about everything, but they want to really work hard about obtaining methamphetamine. But it turned out that they were exactly the same. And we assessed several doses using this paradigm, and it actually looked like, if anything, adults were more hardworking. They would continue to press up to 300 times, but adolescents wouldn't. So it was very interesting. So the vulnerability may not be coming from motivation. And the next time we looked at liver extinction. So extinction, extinction is if you present the drug-associated actions, but there's no drug, then you reduce that behavior. And so this is actually it's confusing. This is the most studied actually model of addiction in animal research, and I think this is one of our flaws, to be honest. So actually extinguishing, doing the drug taking action and removing the drug, like vaping but without the nicotine, or maybe alcoholics in rehab drinking water at a bar but not actually consuming any alcohol, is actually a very impractical way to have treatment. There are things that are happening to sort of do that, but because it is the most studied way in animal research, and that's probably partly why a lot of our findings can't be translated in the human setting, because the way that humans are treated are often not by making them, inject themselves saline, repeating the drug leading action without the drug cue. But we tested that anyway and see what happens. And it turned out that when you take the drug away, the adolescent rats press more overall, but over time, because there's no drug reinforcement, they reduce their response at exactly the same rate as adults. So it's not that they don't learn to inhibit their actions necessarily when the reward is absent.